All right. Good noon, everybody. It's good to have you with us. Welcome back to Lunch Break Apostasies. We took a little bit of a break last week to talk about not necessarily an apostasy, but to talk a common doctrine that are found within various apostasies, that being premillennialism. I'm gonna mostly forego my normal habit of mentioning something that is good or true within the apostasy, which, of course, by the way, does not justify the entirety of the apostasy, but something that is at least relatable, that is something you can work with, and dealing with that. And the reason I'm not doing that this week is just because once again, it's not so much an entire system of doctrines and ideas. It is only one particular doctrine. There's not much redeeming about premillennialism. I guess if I thought real hard, I could come up with something. Maybe the attitude of trying to take the Bible literally, which is often espoused with premillennialism. Of course, when you do much digging, you find out that no, we're not actually trying to take the Bible literally, and it's not really gonna work out like that. So we're not gonna do that this week. However, I did have a receive another question about Baptists, which we covered a couple of weeks ago, and that had to do with some famous congregations of the Baptist Church, having to do with the extreme uh, conservative Baptist churches. We're talking like Westboro Baptist Church, who is famous for um, protesting funerals of homosexuals and of soldiers. And then there is, I think it was called Verity Baptist Church in Sacramento, California, where the pastor um, openly declared that it was morally acceptable to murder homosexuals and praised the Orlando nightclub shooting you might remember from a few years ago. And the question is basically, why is it always seem to be Baptists who are doing this? Well, one, once again, I don't approve of the apostasy in the entirety, but you can't look at a few of the bad apples, if you will, and apply that to the entirety of the Baptist church. Most Baptists do not think that way. But the reason why it always seems to be Baptists who are doing that is because there is so much variety within the Baptist church. I think I mentioned last time that if somebody tells me they're Baptist, they have told me almost nothing because there is so much difference between various Baptist groups. And one subgroup in particular, the Independent Baptists, they can be even more confusing. And the reason being is, as the name implies, there is a great deal of independence and congregational autonomy. They are the ones who tend to emphasize pastoral authority. You remember that idea that we saw that the pastor, and remember, that's not the biblical pastor, that's not a multiplicity of elders who have met a set of very specific requirements. That's just the preacher. They're the ones who tend to believe that the pastor has complete authority over the congregation, and the congregation is required to submit to that one man. Well, when you have a system like that, of course, it's very easy for somebody to abuse that power. And so, once again, this is not descriptive of all independent Baptist church, but there are some independent Baptist churches because of that system where you'll have the one person with all the power. And if they want to do something absolutely insane, there's not much in place to stop them from doing it. They don't answer to somebody higher up the chain, which is, that's biblical if we're talking not making a corporation out of the church. But they also don't have to answer to a multiplicity of elders, which is not biblical, and that's a significant problem. Um, and that's why you get those extremists and why they usually tend to be Baptists. That's a good question. Today we're talking about the Methodist Church. Now, I have historically had a little bit of trouble describing the doctrines of the Methodist Church. And last time on my last go around, I think I finally figured out why I was having so much trouble with this. I think it's because they kind of won. And what I mean by that is the cultural ideas of church that you see prevalent in particularly the United States of America today, although you see this sort of thinking all over the world, a lot of them originate within the Methodist Church. The modern ecumenical movement, the Methodists were highly influential in that. And when you hear a lot of stuff, there is so much people are saying that is very Methodist in its nature, and people don't even realize it. And so when I say they won, I mean they kind of won the culture. The religious mind of your average American is almost certainly influenced by the Methodists, even if they have a negative attitude towards religion, right? Atheistic, something like that, they still tend to take a few Methodist ideas that they take for granted. And so the Methodists sort of provide the framework for a lot of denominationalism you see today. And as a result, a lot of the things that we talk about being distinctive, and the Methodists, by the way, aren't all that distinctive when it comes to their doctrines, meaning unlike the Baptists, there's not a whole lot of things. I couldn't find, for example, a Methodist website or a scholarly paper that says this, and this is what makes somebody a Methodist. Now, back in the day, that was a lot more prevalent, but especially in the modern Methodist Church, that doesn't happen too much. So most of what our discussion is going to be about is about the history of the Methodist Church, how it came to be, and we'll talk about how the doctrine sort of dissipated, for lack of a better term, and now it's much less doctrinally focused. We'll also, if we got time at the end, which I expect we will, we'll also mention some of the current drama that's going on with the Methodist Church. I'm fascinated by it because of the religious, as far as religious history goes, this is probably the biggest event of my lifetime, the current split in the Methodist Church, and so I'm a little interested in what's going on over there. So let's talk a little bit about the Methodists. By the way, before we go any further, that symbol you see there on your screen, I'm making sure my head's kind of blocking it. I keep messing around with my system here. I think it's a little bit better, but as you can see, it has its drawbacks. But let me see if I can't just... Yeah, there we go. Looking there real quick. That symbol is pretty commonly associated with the Methodists. That is a cross with a flame on it. That flame is a representation of the Holy Spirit. So, unlike the Baptists, who don't really have one person you can point to and say, this guy founded it, you have a couple of really influential historical figures, such as John Smith and, what was the other fella's name that's pretty important American? Roger something. Well, anyway, none of them can really be pointed out as a founder of the Baptist Church. At least I don't think so. I don't think there's a strong argument to be made in that. But with the Methodist, you absolutely have a founder, and that is John Wesley. John Wesley was born in 1703, and he was the son of Samuel and Susanna Wesley, who were both very religious people. He was born along with 15 siblings. And as I recall, I think he was born the 16th child, and I don't think that we're done after that, if I remember correctly. But he has these parents who are extremely religiously motivated. Both of them would write biblical commentaries. I think his father was a little bit more focused on that, but his mother was also there. I think she wrote a commentary on the book of Job, if I remember correctly. So they're definitely biblically focused. Basically, their entire lives are about studying the Bible. And because he has so many siblings, his mother is left in charge of the education of the children. Right? Of course, this is in England, by the way, in the 18th century, early 18th century. And you don't really have public education as a thing. Private education does exist, but it's expensive as it is today. And so homeschooling is extremely common in 18th century England, and that's what they're doing here. Because of the amount of children that they have, his mother ends up creating a method for both the education and rearing of the children. You sort of have to. And what I mean by a method is she has a system in place, right? Today we are going to do this. It's all routines and schedules. One of the things, for example, she does is she makes sure to set aside 1 hour at least every week specifically to spend private time with conversation with each of her children. She thinks that's a very important part of their upbringing. By the way, I said I think they had more children. I know they had more children because Charles Wesley was the younger brother of John Wesley. We'll talk about him a little bit later. Once during a house fire, it is said that Wesley was the last one who was left in his house, and it was on the second floor, and his neighbors are said to have come over and saved his life by having one person stand on the shoulders of another, and they take him out the window like that. Um, After that, his mother uh, began the practice of referring to him as a brand plucked from the fire. And so, you got the brand plucked from the fire. That's a reference to the book of Zechariah. And that, beyond just the normal, highly religious focus of his upbringing, that tends to make him think he's a little bit special. And it puts him very much in a ministry mindset. He eventually attends Oxford University, and he begins a religious club with a friend by the name of George Whitfield, who's very important in Methodist history, and then his brother Charles Wesley. And the idea of the club is to begin using to apply certain levels of discipline to each other, right? It's almost an accountability type of deal, right? We're going to make sure that we're going to be the best Christians we can be. In fact, we're going to hold ourselves to even higher standards than perhaps what is necessary. They end up receiving the nickname the Holy Club. That's not their nickname, it's a derogatory from their fellow students who mock them for being so obsessed. But they spend a few hours every week meeting together and in prayer and speaking about their lives, etc., etc. And they borrow a lot of ideas from Wesley's mother. The idea, for example, of speaking privately with one another, making sure you set aside time to have conversation with the important people. That was a big part of the methods of this club. This is not the true beginning of Methodism, but when Methodism starts, it's also going to take a lot of the ideas from the club. Yeah, and as we said, members of the club are expected to live exceptionally holy lives and apply certain methods of Christianity inspired by Wesley's mother. All right. After he gets out of Oxford, he focuses very much on a religious life, and he goes on a mission trip to Savannah, Georgia, which, keep in mind, at this time is still within the British Crown. Oh, we should mention also religiously, he is an Anglican, and just about any time you see somebody in this time period, where they are born is going to tell you pretty much what their religion is. So if you're born in England, chances are you're going to be an Anglican. If you're born in Scotland, chances are you're going to be a Presbyterian. If you are in North Ireland, which at this time I believe is not actually its own country, but is still culturally distinct from the south of Ireland, once again, you're probably going to be Presbyterian. South Ireland's probably going to be Catholic. And then we also have a lot of prominent figures around this time in the Americas. The state matters a little bit. For example, Maryland has a very high Catholic population at this point, but mostly it's going to depend on where they're coming from and what their religious background is going to be. All right, so he's an Anglican. He takes a mission trip to Savannah, Georgia, and on the way he finds himself impressed by a group of Moravians who do not fear a storm because of their personal assurity of salvation. So what goes on is that during a big storm, during the ship ride over, these group of Moravians, which is a now more or less, I mean, I think they still exist, but they're a very small denominational group founded in Germany. They are closely related to some of the Anabaptist denominations we have today, such as the Amish or the Mennonites. They tend to mostly have more reformed doctrines, right? So they're pretty highly Calvinist. But one of the big things that they place an emphasis on is their own surety of salvation. So what happens is during this storm, while almost everybody is frightened out of their minds, you have these Moravians who are calm and they simply sit together in a group and they're singing and they're praying. And after the storm, which of course was not deadly to them, John asks their leader about why they were so calm during this. And the leader of the Moravians really impresses upon John his own surety of salvation. And at one point, he asks Wesley, um, you know, if you died right now, would you be saved? Something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. And while Wesley does say yes, he hesitates. And his own hesitation with that question bothers him a lot. This is also going to be one of those keys when it comes to the establishment of Methodism. He largely fails in his efforts in Georgia. As most of the people of Georgia, the colonists anyway, were already Anglicans. Obviously, he wasn't doing much preaching to them. He was mostly trying to preach to the local Indian slash Native American population, where he did not find much success. Go figure that they might not be too fond of the official state religion of the state that was currently oppressing them. Um, and things kind of go from bad to worse. He ends up getting romantically involved with a local woman who, at his, I want to say parish, I think that's how the Anglicans divide. If you know for sure, let me know. But I think at his local parish, he ends up being in charge of a decent church in Savannah. And for a while, they have this relationship, but she she ends up refusing to marry him, and on the grounds that she doesn't think she would be able to be married at all. They end up breaking up, and then in a very short time later, if I remember correctly, like within a month, she ends up married to this other guy. And Wesley's so angry about this that he ends up excommunicating her or disfellowshipping her, something or other from the church on some other trumped up charges. Well, it just so happens that this girl's father was a judge, magistrate, if I remember correctly. And he ends up putting out an arrest warrant for Wesley, so he ends up fleeing from Georgia back to England. And so his missionary trip was a complete failure. Hey, Jacob following from Kenya. Hey, Jacob, how are you doing? Glad to see you here. Um, so it's just a disaster for him. And he comes back pretty dejected. However, when he returns home to England, he finds that this holy club that he had started with his brother Charles and with George Whitefield, it hasn't gone away. And while it's not really exactly the holy club anymore, many of the same ideas Whitefield has taken from that club and applied it to a much larger audience. And Whitefield is a highly popular preacher in England. He's taken some of these methods and he's done something else which has made him extremely popular. He has gone. Um, Hold on a second. Make sure I'm not. Yeah, I'm not getting ahead of myself here. He has gone not just to the richest people. You see, they had this idea of a pew tax back in the day, or pew rental, I should say. Basically, the idea was, hey, if you wanted to go to church, you had to pay a certain amount of money in order to be able to sit in the pew. So it actually cost money to go to the Anglican Church, which is the only official church of England at that time. Meaning it's almost more of a social status than it is a religious thing. And people felt, the Anglican preachers felt the need to only preach within the churches. Well, Whitefield bucks that trend, and he begins preaching to people out in the open. A lot of open air preaching so that anybody can listen. He goes to fields where farmers are working and he preaches there. He goes into mines and preaches in there. And doing so, they really get the attention of these completely neglected middle and lower class people who have essentially been told that you're not worthy of going to church. So now all of a sudden, you have somebody here who's willing to actually preach to them. He becomes extremely popular doing this. When Wesley sees that Whitefield has been so successful, he's initially um, hesitant to join up with him. He feels it's improper to preach anywhere outside of a church, but he quickly gets over this and even eclipses Whitefield in popularity. He's a very eloquent in his speaking. And the idea that he has to be preaching from a pulpit is just thrown out the window. He ends up, even at one point, preaching from on top of his own father's gravestone because he is so obsessed with just being able to preach anywhere. Now, it should be clear that they have not founded a new denomination at this point. In fact, they never intended to found a new denomination at all, much in the same way that the Reformers did not intend to found a new denomination separate from the Catholic Church. Wesley did not intend to found a denomination separate from the Anglican Church. And in the beginning, and pretty much through the entirety of Wesley's life, Methodists were not separate from the Anglicans, but they were just much like the Holy Club. They were sort of an extra organization on top of the Anglicans. They began to organize themselves using many of the same methods from before. That's the name Methodist. They go into several different classes. So you split yourself up into smaller groups and then you meet together for worship. However, when you're meeting on worship, it is with the Anglicans when you can. On Sundays, but then you have other times, other meeting times that's separate from that. So you have the Methodist Anglicans. And it's not really until towards the end of his life where he ends up in America again and he begins ordaining his own ministers. That's what really causes the schism between the Methodists and the Anglicans. And by the way, at this point in Wesley's life, they would be known as the Episcopalians. That happens during the Revolutionary War, so we're several decades into the life of Wesley at this point. But after all of that time, they begin to. It's the Anglicans who cause the separation there. Many Methodists were already shunned by the rest of the Anglicans in general, but once Wesley starts to ordain his own ministers in America, that's when he really ends up being separated from the Episcopalians or the Anglicans, which happened sort of towards the end of his life. I don't think I have it on this slideshow, but we should also mention that there are one. This was highly the sorry the Methodists. They were highly benefited from really both Great Awakenings, but both the first and the second Great Awakening in America. They had a lot of success because of that. The Methodists, for example, during the second Great Awakening, George Whitefield, he was probably the most successful preacher at the beginning of the second Great Awakening. However, most of the people he baptized ended up becoming Baptists, not Methodists. He quipped that all of my ducks have, or all my eggs, what was it? Something like all my chicken eggs have turned into ducks or something like that. Um, and so you have this bizarre thing going on, but the Methodists had this reputation for having the circuit riders and all these big outdoor camp meetings. The Second Great Awakening is going to be important um, a little bit later on as well. Now, some of the forgot to mention Charles Wesley as well. The brother of John Charles was also quite a successful Methodist preacher, never quite up to the level of fame of his brother. However, Charles was more artistic in his nature, and he ended up writing. John wrote a couple of songs, but Charles wrote a lot of songs. Chances are you know a couple of them. Look at your authors of your hymns at some point. You'll probably see Charles Wesley there a lot. He's up there with people like Isaac Watts as far as prolific hymn writers. So some of the historical doctrines of the Methodist Church. You have the two sacraments idea. Once again, we've gone over this with many of our denominations. The two sacraments, and by the way, if somebody's a two sacrament or two ordinance denomination, it's just about always the exact same two. Remember, you have the seven sacraments in Catholicism or in Orthodoxy. Most Reformation Protestant churches, they only have the two. In this case, it's going to be baptism and communion. One of the big ideas that Wesley had was the idea of entire sanctification. And used to be one of the biggest things that distinguished the Methodists from everybody else. That is, that you sort of have two salvation experiences. You have salvation upon baptism, and so historically Methodists approve of given infant baptism. But then later, you have an entire sanctification experience. If you look at the life of Wesley, that happens, his entire sanctification happens after he returns to England, still bothered by his experience with the Moravians, who are so sure of their salvation. The moment you become so sure of your salvation, which is often inspired by the Holy Spirit, at least according to the Methodists, that is your entire sanctification experience. Historically, the Methodists were highly influential in the temperance movement. In fact, it was the Methodists who pushed for the, I can't remember which number amendment it was, comment if you know it, but the amendment to the Constitution banning the sale and consumption of alcohol in America. The temperance movement was highly pushed by the Methodists. In fact, let me see if I remember the old joke right. I think the joke was, what's the difference between a Methodist and an Episcopalian? The Episcopalian will say hello to you in the liquor store, because the Methodist used to be so extremely against alcohol. That goes all the way back to the Wesleys themselves. Once again, most of these things definitely downplayed within Methodism, especially this last one. As far as I can tell, the historic support for temperance has been more or less entirely dropped within Methodism. Very early support for women in ministry as well. Historically, of course, there's going to be variation between Methodists, but historically, the Methodists were very big into that. Wesley himself is said to have been in favor of women in ministry, and that goes all the way back to the 18th century. They also have a fairly liturgical style of worship, meaning we are going, and once again, this is historically, but this is what we're going to do. You're allowed to do this at this time. This is when we're singing. This is what the sermon's going to be. Maybe the sermon is sent out by the general conference that's going to, this is what the preacher is going to have to preach, etc., etc. That's very opposite of the Baptists, who have like no liturgy whatsoever. The Methodists are very liturgical. This is a holdover from the Episcopalian days, as you recall, the Anglicans, very similar to Catholics. Now let's talk about a few of the subgroups within Methodism. The biggest one, far and away, is the United Methodist, and these are the ones that are currently going through a split. There were many Methodist groups in America for most of the 19th century, and they never would really call themselves just Methodists. And you could subdivide them basically by what language they're speaking. You have your German Methodists and your English Methodists. In fact, Methodist isn't really a good way to phrase the German ones. Maybe Wesleyan would be better. By the way, whenever you hear the term Wesleyan, that refers to John Wesley most commonly, which is why Wesleyan colleges are Methodist colleges. So you have sort of two categories: English speaking Wesleyans, Methodists, and German speaking Wesleyans. And the main reason for the split over there, of course, is the language split. And you have many different forms of these Wesleyans, some of them highly influenced by the Moravians, especially on the German side of things, but they might still consider themselves Wesleyans. One of the biggest ones was the United Brethren, which is actually a mix of two other Wesleyan German denominations that happened a few years before that. And then you have the American Methodist Episcopalian Church, which, of course, at this time is completely split from the actual Episcopalian Church. In 1968, they ended up forming into one church, creating the United Methodist Church, which we know today. Occasionally, you will still see Methodist Episcopalian churches around that still hold to that old title. If you happen to know where Mountain, West Virginia is for my West Virginia friends, as I think there's only one church building there, and it is a Methodist Episcopalian, not United Methodist, Methodist Episcopalian church, which I always thought was interesting for two reasons. One, it seems like they're too stubborn to change to United Methodist. And two, if you know the story of Mountain, West Virginia, it wasn't always called Mountain. It used to be called Mole Hill, West Virginia. And so the joke is they made Mountain out of Mole Hill. Well, that church is called Mole Hill Methodist Episcopalian Church. So I don't know if no one ever bothered to change the sign since like the 60s, or if there's somebody there was just very much against all sort of change, but it's called Mole Hill Methodist Episcopalian Church. The church is very corporate, for lack of a better term, as far as governing goes. You have several conferences in the Methodist Church. Usually these are over certain areas. I think state is usually the size, but it might be a little bit larger or smaller depending on the size of the state. These ones will meet. These are called the annual conferences. That means that all the churches, representatives are meeting together to discuss whatever happens to be necessary at these times. And then you have a general conference, which is all of these conferences coming together. It doesn't happen every year. I think it happens every 4 years, if I remember correctly. And decisions are made by that general conference as well. There is a lot of power in the conferences. The property of these churches belong not to themselves, but to the conferences. The preachers in the Methodist Church, at least historically, I don't know if this is still true, but historically, the preachers do not work for the congregations, they work for their conferences. So there's a lot of power in the conferences. When we talk about the split that's going on right now, that's another important factor. As we already mentioned, many of the historic doctrines were gradually dropped within the Methodist Church. However, they still hold to a book of discipline, and this is essentially authoritative within the Methodist Church. A couple other of the Wesleyan denominations. The African Methodist Episcopals. If you ever see a church, once again, West Virginia friends, if you're from around my neck in the woods and you ever travel from Ranson or Charlestown over to Shepherdstown, on that road by a train track, there is a church that is an AME church. That would be an African Methodist Episcopal church. The African Methodist Episcopals are a splinter group from the old American Methodist Episcopal Church, which, as you'll recall, that's the one that united with the United Brethren to create the United Methodist Church. They didn't really get created out of purely doctrinal reasons. It was entirely out of racist reasons, because there were many black members of Methodist churches who were mistreated, not allowed to be part of certain activities because of the color of their skin. They end up splitting apart. The modern African Methodist Episcopalian Church is not exclusive to African membership, according to themselves. It's just but the main reason it exists, which, by the way, as far as I can tell, the modern Methodists do not have this problem of racism and not allowing blacks to serve, at least not in the. If they do have that problem, it sure isn't on paper. I'll put it like that. But of course, the African Methodist Episcopal still exists. They're small, but they still exist. The Church of the Nazarene. This is another one where I wouldn't really call it Methodist necessarily. Very much Wesleyan, though. And the Church of the Nazarene is basically the conservative version of the Methodists. For my friends in around central eastern Ohio, you are probably very familiar with the Church of the Nazarene. There's a lot of membership over there. Much more conservative, much more rules oriented, and much more doctrinal than the Methodists. And they also tend to hold a lot more to the historical Wesleyan doctrines, such as the idea of entire sanctification, if I'm not mistaken. Temperance, I believe, is pretty big with the Nazarene. And then you have the Global Methodist Church, which has to do with what I was talking about before with the split with the United Methodist. I went too far, and now my computer won't let me go back to where I was, so you're going to get to look at a black screen for the rest of this. What essentially has been happening with that split between the United Methodists and the Global Methodists. Back in the must have been 16 General Conference of the United Methodists, there was a big question about homosexuality. And there was a large liberal movement within the church, especially in America, to remove phrasing in the Book of Discipline having to do with homosexuality, basically forbidding homosexual marriage, homosexual clergy. Those are the two big ones. But the general idea is homosexuality going to be considered sinful or not? Well, when the General Assembly happened, the vote turned out that they said, no, this is going to continue to be part of the Book of Discipline. Homosexuality is not going to be considered acceptable within the Methodist Church. I'm oversimplifying. That's the essence, however, of the problem. Give me 1 second here. Let me see if I can adjust this so you're not having to look at mostly a black screen. There we go. Now you get to look at my ugly face. Aren't you happy? The vote went in favor of the conservative faction, who were not in favor of allowing for gay clergy or for them to perform gay weddings. The reason this happened is because the General Conference of the Methodist Church is global, meaning anybody who is Methodist gets an equal say in it. And even though this denomination is historically considered very American-centric, there is an extremely large portion of the Methodist Church that exists within Africa. Africa, if you didn't know, is nowhere near as liberal as the United States or Europe, for that matter, as far as homosexuality is concerned. And so even though the majority of the American church was in favor of these changes, that certainly wasn't the case in the African church, and so the vote didn't go through. Now, you would think then that if there's going to be a split, it would be the liberal side splitting from the conservative side, but it was the opposite. Because even though this was the rule, those in charge in the American church simply refused to enforce it. And so there were a couple of instances where you'd have openly gay clergy or clergy performing gay weddings, and nothing would happen to them. They'd be fine. As a result, many Methodist congregations believed they saw the writing on the wall and tried to split from the Methodist Church. Now, remember, there's a problem from before, because if you were in the Methodist Church, of course, you're allowed to just leave, but you can't take the church building with you, because that doesn't belong to your congregation. That belongs to the conference. They ended up working out a system wherein the state conference, the annual conferences, would be allowed to work out their own system, but basically if a church had a majority vote that they wanted to leave the church, they could, and up until a certain point, they would also be able to keep their property with them. However, many of the annual conferences made it essentially impossible to do this. This is where one of the big bits of drama is right now. I think the Georgia Annual Conference is one of the ones who are guilty of this, where no, we're not going to let you leave unless literally every single member of your congregation votes to leave. That's caused a whole lot of drama. The date to leave and still be able to retain your property or get this property has come and gone at this point. That's caused a lot of drama. They are not allowing the same rules for the African church, and many of them don't want to leave anyway. So, what's essentially going to happen is the majority of the conservative churches are going to leave. Obviously, by the next general conference, which I believe is very soon, it was supposed to happen in 2020, but because of COVID, it didn't. But by the next general conference, it's expected that phrasing will be removed from the Book of Discipline, and then everybody who is still within the Methodist Church, even if they don't agree, they're essentially going to be stuck. So it's causing a lot of problems within the African Church as well. You would not believe some of the things that the American liberals of the Methodist Church are saying about the African Church. It is just grossly racist. And so I've been astounded by it. Anyway, that's just a quick little overview for you. It's it's good little bit of popcorn drama. Anyway, the Global Methodist Church has sort of been the counter. Many of these, I believe, most of the churches who end up leaving the United Methodist Church end up becoming independent or community churches, but many of them have formed together into the new Global Methodist Church, and so that's what the Global Methodist Church is. All right, that about wraps up everything we have for the Methodists. I thank you very much for your attention, and I always love getting to talk to you. Next week, we are once again not going to be talking about a denomination in particular, but we're going to be talking about the Restoration Movement. Of course, if you're familiar with the Restoration Movement, you know that has a whole lot to do with the Church of Christ. So why am I keeping that in an Apostasies series? Well, the reason mainly is there have been a lot of apostasies that have come out of the Restoration Movement. In fact, about every apostasy that has been formed since the Restoration Movement in some way or another has been influenced by the Restoration Movement. So we need to talk about that as well. So that's what we'll be up for next week. Until then, love you all. Hope to see you then.